Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you see me on the video? I see all of you sitting down, so welcome. I'm Victor Dzau, the president of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, and I want to welcome all of you in attendance, in person or virtually. Just a few reminders to the audience before we begin. We have 4 outstanding speakers, whom I'll be introducing very shortly. We'll start with video presentation from each speaker before turning to Q&A for the final 30 minutes or so. At any point during today's session, you can leave a question for any or all our speakers in the Q&A box. My special assistant will be monitoring the questions. So let me begin by saying, as president of NAM, I support the mission of the InterAcademy partnership and the Young Academies. We know that global collaboration among academies and scientists across the globe is crucial in creating inclusive, responsive, and productive research. Now, the theme of today's meeting is rethinking our research structures. Our panel will bring important insights onto how to do that in the field of emerging technologies. Today, we'll be discussing societal and ethical implications of these emerging health sciences and technologies. So we all know that advances in science and technology are leading to high-paced innovation with tremendous potential to transform health and medicine. That includes progress in AI, human genome editing, regenerative medicine, and much more. Now, as we consider this, we know that these innovations also take risk. They carry risk for potential unintended consequences, along with major societal implications. Those concerns relate to issues of equity, access, escalating costs, privacy, disruption to social norms, and many others. So there's a great need for our society to understand the implications of these advances, to be better prepared for them, and to take steps to mitigate any kind of risk. The issues so far are far-reaching and usually span multiple sectors. So unfortunately, the implication of these emerging technologies are often considered only within one technology or one sector-specific silos. So that's why we need to think about how to look at these technologies in the context of multiple sectors. Now, Rossant and Wallach in 2015 wrote, and I quote, "Emerging technologies involve a complex mix of applications, risks, benefits, uncertainties, stakeholders, and public concerns. As a result, no single entity is capable of fully governing any of these multifaceted and rapidly developing fields and the innovative tools and technology that they produce." End of quote. So now you can see why we need a cross-sectoral coordinated framework to guide development and use of emerging technology and science in health and medicine while mitigating potential undesirable side effects. So when we began to look at this issue, the National Academy of Medicine established a committee on emerging science, technology, and innovation in health and medicine called CESTI, C-E-S-T-I. CESTI was established in 2020, and committee members are drawn from diverse academic disciplines, professional backgrounds, and sectors, representing health, biomedical sciences, ethics, social sciences, law, regulation, industry, investment, and other disciplines. And many of the committee members are well known to you. And this CESTI was co-chaired by Atul who's a member of our panel today, as well as Atul Charo and George Daly. We're also joined on today's panel by Jeff Kahn, who also served as a member of CESTI. So in addition to the expertise on the panel, CESTI engaged and consulted a remarkable number of experts from across states and countries and different disciplines to add to diversity of perspective. That's all reflected in CESTI's work. So CESTI developed a detailed case study approach to analyze technology impacts and governance, then distill the lessons based on the work to date, and develop a high-level governance framework. This framework identifies a set of ethical principles and values to guide the governance of emerging technology. So I won't go over what is being done. In fact, we have some speakers today to talk about this field. CESTI did develop a preliminary tool to assess the performance of an emerging technology across these guiding principles. And the tool is intended to identify areas for attention and possible actions. So now we have moved from CESTI's work to a consensus study that was initiated this year. So National Academy is undertaking this issue, co-chaired by Keith Yamamoto and Keith Weiler. And again, it's taking where CESTI left off and moving into a study that will provide concrete, actionable recommendations for implementation, a cross-sectoral governance ecosystem for emerging science and technology. So that's where we are. And to explore this topic today, we have 4 fantastic speakers who will be providing thoughts on the governance of this emerging technology. And they are, as you hear very shortly, Atul Butte from UCSF, Jeff Kahn from Johns Hopkins, Janet Rossant from the Gairdner Foundation, University of Toronto, and David Winickoff from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. So we'll start first with some brief pre-recorded video presentation from all the members. Then we'll turn to a live Q&A session. And Atul, Jeff, and Janet will join me. For David, it's 4:30 a.m. Europe. He says he's going to try. We'll see. So with that, let me start with a video presentation. First is Dr. Atul Butte, who's the co-chair of CESTI. And of course, he's the Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg Distinguished Professor and inaugural director of the Barker Computational Health Science Institute at UCSF. He's also the chief data scientist for the entire UC California health system. He'll set the stage by discussing ethics in the field of digital health, data science, and AI. This will be followed by other speakers. So let's play your video.
Hello, my name is Atul Butte. I'm the chief data scientist for the entire University of California health system, of which it's made of 6 medical schools, so 6 academic health centers, 12 hospitals, and more than 1,000 care delivery sites. I'm also a professor and institute director at the University of California, San Francisco. And I'm here to talk about the coming challenges in big data, especially as we think about ethical frameworks for the future, and especially as we think about clinical data. First, I have so many conflicts of interest, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't believe another word I said over the next 10 minutes or so. We are certainly surrounded by data, and it seems to be getting bigger. It is hard to pick up any magazine, any major magazine or journal without seeing a cover like one of these you see here. And indeed, The Economist magazine covers it again and again. At the bottom, you see first the data deluge, and now The Economist suggests that data is the world's most valuable resource, literally equating data and those data companies to oil rigs. In fact, this saying is used commonly, that data is the new oil. And then people say that if data is the new oil, then AI is the new engine. I actually don't like this phrase, data is the new oil, because it suggests a possessiveness around data, that either I have that barrel of oil or you do. But indeed, data is different, that I might have data and do something with it, and you might have that same data and do something else with it. And so thus data is divisible, and it does not lose any integrity as we divide it. So I prefer the saying from another one of these TED Talks that data is the new soil, that you plant your ideas and watch them grow. But certainly data is surrounding us, and it is surrounding us in biomedicine as well. Shown here are just a few of literally hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of logos surrounding major projects from all around the world, especially those from the National Institutes of Health, for which data has been collected, whether molecular or cellular, or certainly research data, clinical data, Cohorts like the UK Biobank and the All of Us research program are listed, and many others. And not only do these repositories continue to grow in size exponentially, the number of repositories grows exponentially as well. So we are surrounded by these types of data sets, and it's only a matter of time before we start to think about what should we do with all this data. And indeed, a particular type of data that is most sensitive, but probably the most fruitful for the future, is clinical data. Shown here are 3 press releases illustrating how much money is spent in the United States to collect electronic health record data. Of course, a lot of this has been done in the past 10 to 15 years, coming out of National Academy of Medicine reports illustrating how many medical errors are made and how electronic health records might solve that problem. That remains to be seen, of course. Nonetheless, you can see 3 health systems here spending between $1 billion, $1.2 billion, and $4 billion on electronic health record systems. Now, of course, not all this money goes to the software. It goes to training. It goes to reimagining and re-engineering workflows. But you can see that there are billions spent here. So I might then naturally have this narrative, and I carry this narrative everywhere, that if given how many billions of dollars we in the United States have spent on this kind of data, what a national tragedy it will be if we don't use this data to improve the practice of medicine. Of course, this data must be used safely, responsibly, respectfully, but what an astounding national tragedy it will be if we don't use this data to improve the practice of medicine. And so that is where we see a lot of health systems and companies moving forward. But of course, there's a lot of concern all along the way. Now, one big proponent of how this data is being used actually is the Food and Drug Administration, the US FDA. And so the US FDA has been really pushing the use of this data, clinical data, going backwards in research in some ways, in a program called Real World Evidence. We used to just call it clinical data. Now the FDA calls it real world data, or real world evidence. And indeed, we're starting to see how the FDA is illustrating to pharma, biotech manufacturers, and device makers how their products can be approved solely using existing data. In other words, no clinical trial. There are many of these examples, but I think the best one so far is with Pfizer and Ibrance. You see the article at the bottom left here, where the use of this particular molecule, the molecule was already being used for female breast cancer, and it was being used off-label for male breast cancer. Well, so many males were already being treated off-label, and it would be so difficult to actually gather enough males with breast cancer. It's a rare, super rare disorder. It would be so difficult to do that, and so much data already existed that Pfizer was able to convince the Food and Drug Administration that existing data can and should be used to gain a labeled indication for the molecule for breast cancer. And indeed, that's what's happened. On the bottom left there, you can see this also extends to the device world. The Sapien 3 artificial heart valve gained a new indication based on clinical data. And now existing clinical data is being used, or at least being proposed, as what's called a synthetic control arm. This isn't synthetic data. This is an artificial control arm where patients might be dosed with a particular molecule in one part of the world, and the control group is existing data from another part of the world. So you can see how fast this world is moving. I think the oldest article I'm showing here is just 5 years old. So existing data can save a lot of time, money, and effort for pharma and biotech manufacturers. Clearly, then one can see a financial interest in this. Health systems then have been starting to leverage their clinical data. I'm just showing a few articles here, but many, many health systems are doing this. Geisinger is a major health system in Pennsylvania that has launched several different startups. The one I'm particularly showing here is called XG, or taking what they learned and taking it out of Geisinger, and that's still to be seen how successful they'll be. University of Pittsburgh Medical Center invested $100 million in big data. This was in 2012. And more recently, John Halamka and the Mayo Clinic platform launched their digital data business just recently in 2020. So health systems have started to recognize that that data is useful, is valuable, especially, again, given the narrative that we should be improving what we do in medicine with this data. Now, hospitals have gone even further, trying to pool their data to gain more leverage. One example here is Truveta, based in Seattle, which includes the health data from many health systems, not just hospitals, health systems, including Common Spirit and Providence Healthcare, which are major health systems in the United States, faith-based health systems, along with many of the other logos you see here. And they launch a company like this with $95 million to get started. So you can see there is a significant amount of investor interest in this type of approach as well. There are millions of dollars in health system data now, and we see mergers in the billions of dollars. Datavant and Ciox, this is in 2021, merged, combined entity of about $7 billion. Cerner, an electronic health record system, purchased Kantar Health, another real-world evidence company, for about $1/3 billion. Edion, launched out of Boston, Massachusetts, has now raised $250 million with their algorithms and data-driven types of approaches. Verana, with eye and neurology data, recently raised a $100 million round. So this was in 2020. And Mayo Clinic has invested in Inference. Inference just completed a $60 million round. All of these, again, are just in the past 1 to 3 years. So you can see how much this field is accelerating. Now, sometimes big tech companies get involved as well. And again, that raises even more concerns. IBM acquired Exploris now going about 7 years ago. Exploris was spun out of the Cleveland Clinic system in 2009 with a lot of healthcare data. You can see there 1/3 trillion longitudinal data points. IBM purchased other companies at the same time. Here's Truven Healthcare for $2.6 billion. And then very recently offloaded all of that because sometimes big tech is its own worst enemy. And now a private equity firm, an investment firm, owns all of that data. This is Francisco Partners. Google has the same issue where, as you can see from 10 years ago, Google has been given access to healthcare data of, for example, the NHS Trust, the Royal Free NHS Trust. Now, as concerning as that might seem to folks, it is curious that when this article came out about 10 years ago, the quote in the article said, well, essentially Google and DeepMind didn't get anything more than the other 1,500 companies that have already received this NHS patient data. So Google was just the 1,501st, I suppose, to get access to this data. Many third-party organizations have access to this data. And Google, Amazon, Microsoft are battling to have access and store and analyze that data in the cloud. Google itself invests in other companies. I already mentioned Verana. Google is an investor in Verana from the previous slide. Google strikes deals with hospital chains to develop and co-develop healthcare algorithms. Mayo in particular has struck a 2-year partnership with Verily, one of the Google internal spinouts. Again, this is just last year, this article. And then Google Health is being dismantled. And again, sometimes big tech is its own worst enemy as they start to refocus and re-engineer within Google. Tech companies are learning, even from us, on how to even read our clinical notes, even better than we can. As many might know, in healthcare, a lot of the care is documented not just in structured data, but in unstructured data. Some of that might be images. A lot of it is in text narratives or letters or reports. And both Amazon and Google are working intensely to try to read and understand those notes, probably better than we are developing those in our systems. Now, EHR data can add incredible value to molecular and genetic data can add much value to the EHR data. Health systems, for example, like Geisinger, have worked for years now with pharma companies like Regeneron to be able to use that genetics data that Regeneron provides to add value and care, better care for their patients. For example, finding patients with breast cancer risk or risk for familial hypercholesterolemia well before any lab tests are abnormal. Now, this sounds great, and this is valuable, and we probably want more of this to continue, but of course we have to do this and have to show how this is being done in a community, patient-centric way to making sure that the data is used and stewarded carefully. And where does all of our data go? As we showed the best of times and the worst of times during the coronavirus epidemic, we are still not sure where all of this data goes. Why is it that some major health entities, for example, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, is often the last to have data? You can see, for example, the bottleneck for the coronavirus response, the glorious fax machine, cited again and again, where lab testing is still sent the fastest way sometimes is by fax. It's the fastest way and sometimes the slowest way. Many reports have been sent with web-based spreadsheets and including Excel. And so you would think we'd have better ways to do this, and sadly, sometimes we do not. Yeah, here's the story with COVID and Excel, how 16,000 test results might have been misplaced based on how Microsoft handles data in spreadsheets here. We also learned that data can sometimes be used against health systems themselves. Certainly at the beginning part of the pandemic, there were major fights and skirmishes over protective equipment, for example, masks, many of which were written up in major journals like the New England Journal of Medicine. Here, for example, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal that showed some hospitals refused to document how many patients were or were not in their intensive care units with COVID, such that they would not necessarily get transfers of patients, which they felt they could lose money over. So yes, indeed, in the middle of a pandemic, we had hospitals still thinking about finances and not documenting the data in the middle of a public health crisis. And there's more in this article here. Now, another big use of all of this data is to train computers to learn what we're doing in medicine. That is obviously artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the FDA is pushing forward in that direction as well with their proposed regulatory guidelines. 600 tools are now approved by the Food and Drug Administration, 200 just in radiology. This website has many of the radiology ones documented, and you can see many small and large companies have already figured out how to get artificial intelligence trained using clinical data to get that artificial intelligence approved, and thus perhaps at some point sold back to us in health systems as tools that our doctors and nurses and administrators can use. Now, I think we need more transparency developed and published models. We and many others have published guidelines like this, that we need more transparency and minimum information so we can evaluate these models. You can see our paper here published in Nature Medicine. But I think the inbounding of these algorithms, when we bring them on, I think we're going to need a lot of thought into how do we make sure these algorithms stay working, don't get stuck with biases, and to make sure that proper care is being used and algorithms are maintained in a hospital setting. The same way, for example, when we put a drug on drug formulary, that we're very careful about it. Perhaps we should at least be as careful when we bring artificial intelligence into the hospital. But it is a complicated environment right now with biases and much lack of transparency. We have biased medical algorithms used commonly from major vendors that Ziad Obermeyer and many others have now written about the flaws in some of these algorithms. Certainly, it's not just medical algorithms, but even text-based processing. If trained using internet text, well, internet text isn't necessarily at the Shakespeare level. It can be coarse, it can be rude, and it can be certainly biased. So we have to be careful in that way. There are continual battles over ethical artificial intelligence at the machine learning conferences. And just this past summer in the United States, our Department of Health and Human Services have now proposed rules to strengthen non-discrimination by algorithm in healthcare to make sure our algorithms are not biasing care at the federal level. Here in California, we have certainly had our state attorney general launch an inquiry and send a letter to 30 hospitals asking about how these algorithms are being used and stewarded. And just even more recently, last month, the Food and Drug Administration said that AI tools that, for example, predict for sepsis is a very common yet lethal problem. AI tools that warn for sepsis should be regulated as devices. They cannot be taken less seriously than that. And literally within days, Epic itself, one of the major electronic health record vendors with the sepsis algorithm, has already proposed how they're going to overhaul their algorithm. A lot is changing, and a lot is changing fast. And in the middle of all that, we have the White House now proposing a brand new AI Bill of Rights. So I'm really proud to be serving on the Committee of Emerging Science, Technology, and Innovation in Healthcare and Medicine, or CESTI, in the National Academy of Medicine. I believe that this this organization and this particular committee is just at the start of creating frameworks. Maybe not creating the rules, but creating the frameworks of how we should be thinking about and how we can all get to rules and guidance, not just in data, but across all of health and medicine. Now, this sounds grandiose. It is. This sounds ambitious, and it is. But if this doesn't start now, we are going to continually run into problems again and again. And it makes sense to think about all of these things right now. They're certainly top of mind now in data and in gene editing and in medical devices. But the ethical challenges and guidance and governance challenges are never going to go away. It makes sense to start to put some structure on how we should be solving these problems for here and into the future. So with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Atul, very much indeed. Very provocative talk, and I'm sure we have lots of chance to ask you questions on some of the issues you talk about. Let me next turn to Dr. Janet Rossant. She's the President and Scientific Director of the Gairdner Foundation and in Canada. She's a senior scientist emeritus in developmental and stem cell biology program at Hospital for Sick Children, University professor emeritus in Department of Molecular Genetics at University of Toronto. Jen will be talking about ethics and governance of biotechnology, particularly what we're seeing in terms of advances in development area and using examples of guidance and governance and need for incentives to catalyze change. So Janet, over to you with a video.
Hello, everybody. My pleasure to be with you. I'm going to quickly share my screen and begin.
Well, you are not Janet. You are Jeff Kahn.
My name is.
I apologize. That was next on my list. So let me find the right video.
Okay. I thought Janet changed in her looks. There you go.
Advances in life sciences and new biotechnologies are really changing the way we understand human biology and have great implications for the future of medicine. But along with this come ethical concerns and societal issues that require us to think about new governance models. Major game changers in life sciences, there are many. This is a very exciting time to be working in biomedicine. So many technologies that are helping us understand human biology and disease. Next generation genome sequencing, being able to sequence individual genomes for less than $1,000. Making stem cells from any person that allows us to make tissues that can be used to treat degenerative diseases. CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, the ability to edit DNA in such a way that we can think about curing genetic diseases and using this to help cancer therapies. Over and above all of this, integrating these and other technologies, we think about synthetic biology, making new cells, making novel tissues, novel organs, and maybe even novel organisms. AI and data science, we've just heard how this is really changing the way we think about organizing and integrating all these things together to bring around a real future of personalized medicine. But there are, along with all these exciting new technologies, there are societal, social, and ethical implications. How is society going to address the ethical challenges that arise from new biotechnologies? How will they impact on equity and social justice? And are we going to see a reshaping and impact on societal norms worldwide? To consider these, we need to think about governance models. How can we bring in a governance framework to allow us to deal with the development of these new technologies? So we have to think what we mean by governance. And the first paragraph here I've taken from a WHO report, which I think to me exemplifies what we mean. Good governance is value-based and principle-driven. It promotes public trust by ensuring public values and viewpoints are carefully considered as part of the policy-making process. With that in mind, any governance structure that we bring into play must ensure that ethical and societal implications of any novel research are considered from the very outset of that research program, and that mitigation strategies are defined all the way along. Governance must include addressing potential inequities in access that arise due to systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, global disadvantaged populations. And in all of these, to get public trust, we must have a robust public engagement strategy as a key component. So this is all very well and easy perhaps to say, but implementing governance in these exciting and fast-moving areas is difficult. I'm going to give you two examples that are closer to my area of research, where we have tried, various people have tried to bring international governance in controversial biotechnologies. The two I want to talk about are human heritable gene editing and human embryo and stem cell research. So let's start with heritable gene editing. I mentioned CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing as the tool that has changed the way we think about treating single gene diseases in humans. Many of the diseases you see listed here are single genetic diseases that one can think about now fixing in the cells of the people who have the disease using gene editing. Also, you see cancer immunotherapy here, genetically modified T cells that can kill cancer cells. Incredibly exciting. This is therapeutic use of gene editing. But the person you fix still carries a genetic mutation in their other cells, and particularly they carry the mutation that they would pass on to their offspring. So given that, if we can fix genes in the person who has a disease, why would you want to wait to treat the patient? Why not try to prevent the disease by modifying the gene back in the early embryo so that all the cells of the resulting baby or person are fixed, and in fact fixed forever, so that the gene is no longer passed on? This is what is called heritable gene editing. And this has been the most controversial part of the whole CRISPR experience. And it comes up with this concept you see in the middle here, this concept of designer babies. Where do we draw the line? Concept of preventing serious genetic disease, most people would think is okay. But what if we extend this and think about modifying humans in ways like altering their IQ, sport enhancement, many of the modifications that might change the way we think about what it means to be human. This has caused many, many discussions around the world. Many eminent working groups have come together to discuss the ethics of this. Most recently, the National Academies came out with this heritable genome editing workshop report, and WHO actually came out and proposed a governance model in this area. I would say that despite the fantastic work that's been done and the many eminent people who've got together to discuss this, we don't have any governance models that have actually been implemented in this area. And the only thing that everybody agrees on is that as it stands, this technology is not available. It's still too risky to be applied to embryos and humans today. So the safety is not there. But what about the future? This is a very small area of biotechnology that, even when safe, is never going to be implemented on a major scale worldwide. And yet even here, with all the erudite people who've considered this, I don't think we've really implemented or put in place a clear governance framework. So it just illustrates how hard it is to do this ahead of when things are changing all the time. So let's broaden it out then. Let's go not just gene editing, heritable gene editing in babies. Let's look at the broader aspects of human embryo research, which has been going on for a long time and does affect a lot more people. The first IVF baby was born in 1978. I was actually in the lab in Cambridge where Steptoe and Edwards were working on this technology. It was incredibly controversial. Today, something like 10% of all babies in North America are born by some form of reproductive technology. We went on from IVF to cloning, to stem cells, to gene editing, human pig chimeras, and then more recently, and I'll just give you an example here, now extended culture of human embryos and making models of human embryos with stem cells. Many areas, always controversial and always challenging. So let's just talk. I'll give you an example, the most recent one, extended culture of embryos and stem cell models. And this work I'm going to show you now is all done in mouse at this point. And the first paper came out last year from Jakob Hanna at the Weizmann Institute, where he in the mouse took early post-implantation embryos and put them in a culture system and into these roller bottles, as you see here, that allowed oxygen and gases to flow through. And these embryos could go right through development, not all the way, but to the point where they were developing organs and a brain. With this in mind, he then went on, took not just embryos, but stem cells. He combined stem cells that would make all the three early cell types of the embryo, put them together in little aggregates, and when they got to a certain point, transferred them back to the roller culture system, and was able in that culture system to get these stem cell models to go through and look quite similar to, again, about an 8-day mouse embryo, quite dramatic. Similar work from Magda Zernick-Jagertz's lab in Cambridge shows a similar outcome, and this is a picture from their paper. On the left is one of these stem cell models, and on the right is a real mouse embryo. Green marks the head, pink marks the heart, and you can see that both the model and the embryo have an anterior-posterior patterning, have a developing heart, and the model looks quite similar, quite remarkably similar, not the same, but very similar to the intact embryo. So this is brand new work and just at its beginning. But of course, that's the mouse. Jakob Hanna has already set up a company in Israel called Renew Bio, where they intend to culture human stem cell-derived embryos, transfer this technology to the human to generate stem cells, organs and stem cells for therapy. So this is challenging then what people are doing here. At what point do these stem cell models actually become more like an embryo? And does it challenge what we mean to have human organismic potential? Huge ethical and societal concerns that we're not ready, I think, to deal with. So how do we deal with this? Well, this is where I want to say that although there's no framework here and regulations are very hard to keep up, there is a possibility for professional societies to step in. And in this area of human embryo research, the International Society for Stem Cell Research has played an important role over the years and has had guidelines since 2006. The first guidelines for human embryo and stem cell research came out of ISSCR. They've been updated every 5 years, and the most recent were reported in 2021. And these guidelines have set out framework that can be used globally in different jurisdictions and actually have been accepted as de facto regulations in several jurisdictions. If you want to publish in human embryo and stem cell research, you need to abide by the guidelines, and journals expect that. And because it's a professional society, the group does try to keep ahead of research developments. So did we? 2021 was the last report. I just gave you 2022 discoveries with stem cell models. Had we thought about stem cell models? The answer was yes. And there are some guidelines in there that do set out the sort of framework for review of these kind of experiments. And perhaps the most important guideline is the first one, that these stem cell models should not ever be transplanted to a human or animal uterus. So are there incentives to promote good governance? I believe there are. Obviously, laws and regulations can be used, but they are blunt instruments, particularly laws, because they are inflexible, very hard to change. Professional societies can set norms, I've just described that. Funders can set restrictions on what they will fund. Publishers can require abiding by guidelines. Professional bodies can, professional accreditation can be important. And always, ongoing discussion and open discussion in international workshops and forums is a key component. But can governance models keep up and stay ahead of the science? Almost certainly the answer is no. Case studies and cross-disciplinary workshops can certainly help. We've talked about foresight workshops. I think we need to have farsight, not just foresight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Another outstanding talk. Lots of food for thought. I'm trying to turn my video on, and because host has stopped my video. Thank you. All right. So another great talk, lots of great ideas. We're going to park it there and move to the next speaker, whom you actually saw briefly for a few moments, and that's in fact Jeff Kahn. Jeff is the Andreas Dracopoulos Director of Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, and the Levi Professor of Bioethics and Public Policy. He is Professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management in Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Now, Jeff served on CESTI, that committee in which Atul Butte co-chaired, and he's going to talk a little bit about ethical principles. He's a bioethicist. Let's play the video with Jeff.
Hello, everybody. My pleasure to be with you. I'm going to quickly share my screen and begin my presentation. My name is Jeffrey Kahn. I'm director of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're in Baltimore, Maryland in the US. It's my pleasure to be part of this panel, and I'm going to talk today about ethics principles and governance frameworks for emerging biotechnologies, and look forward to the conversation after the panel. When I talk about this topic, I always like to start with this screenshot of a fuzzy journal article that was published in June of 1975 in Science magazine. It's the recommendations of the Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA Molecules. I show it because it provides, I think, a helpful bookend for the discussion of science policy related to emerging biotechnologies and attempts to provide responsible governance. Of course, in this case, the scientific community, after meeting at Asilomar, issued recommendations to try to police itself. don't want to say more about whether it was successful or not, but an interesting bookend to the conversation. Of course, in the 21st century, it's a different story. Governance of international science is much more challenging for a few reasons. One, science is far more democratic, small d, than in the past. So there's not one or two countries that have leadership and therefore control over a technology as they did with recombinant DNA in the past, when the US and the UK were really the leaders. And there's much less expertise, less specialized labs, much cheaper reagents and necessary tools to do the kind of science related to things like CRISPR and other gene editing tools than recombinant DNA technologies in the 1970s. Even if there were a desire, it's really hard to imagine self-policing being possible because there just aren't obvious mechanisms and because there isn't a concentration, I should say, of expertise and leadership. It just becomes very difficult to imagine how that would happen. So what can we expect, or what can we plan for? How can we plan our way through the issues arising with the governance of emerging biotechnologies in 2022 and going forward? I'm going to talk really briefly about two examples, which I think help set the stage for some more general conclusions and takeaways. So I'm going to talk about two emerging reproductive technologies. MRT is mitochondria replacement techniques, and HG, human genome editing. And the question is really about ethics and governance. And so in these two, in the example of these two cases, or in the case of these two examples, a few things were consistent as matter of ethics principles, which lead to governance. So first, minimize risk to the children that would be created using these technologies, these tools. There needs to be sufficient likelihood of efficacy shown by animal and in vitro human research before you'd even go forward in a clinical trial that would actually try to create a child using either of these technologies. Limitation to offering the technologies to women who are at risk of transmitting only serious disease, and known that the disease predicted would be severe for the child who would be born with it. There are ways to reduce the risk of concerns about things like adverse events or unintended consequences of the technology being passed to future generations. So in the case of MRT, that means policy that would limit the implantation of embryos that were male, right? So since mitochondria are passed through the maternal line, if you implant only male embryos, you won't pass the mitochondria that has been manipulated, inserted into the embryo. And maybe most important for the conversation today, what can be done about emerging reproductive technology tourism and the cross-border governance that it would seem to require. So lest you think these are hypothetical concerns, this is a screenshot from an article published in New Scientist in September of 2016, announcing the birth of the first baby born by the so-called three-parent technique, that's mitochondrial replacement. It was performed by this reproductive medicine physician who runs clinics in New York and elsewhere in the US. He established a satellite clinic in Guadalajara, Mexico, and performed MRT for a couple from Amman, Jordan. So reproductive tourism, and very difficult to control when it's a physician from one country opening a satellite in another and performing the procedure on a couple from a third country. So what do we do? Well, the National Academy of Medicine in the US, which of course is a member of the group that's hosting this meeting, convened a committee to examine human genome editing and the science, ethics, and governance issues related to it. I served on this committee. Important for my remarks is really just the first part of this slide, the global principles for research and clinical use of human genome editing. And so this committee, among its recommendations, identified 7 principles that we thought were critically important for guiding the governance of this emerging technology, whatever country decided to undertake it and undertake oversight and governance of it. So as you see here, the 7 high-level principles: promoting well-being, that's of the children who would be born; transparency in the way the science is done; exercising due care, that's about being cautious; performing the science in a responsible way. Respect for persons is about the individuals who would seek these services, so that's really the parents. Fairness is about equitable access, and transnational cooperation speaks to the governance issues that I've already made a nod to. I don't want to say more about that slide, and this slide is also from the same commission report, and I only show it because this is the list of criteria in much more fine grain that the 7 principles were used to create in terms of going forward with heritable germline editing. In other words, modification of human gametes or human embryos such that they would have heritable genetic modification. So all these 10 criteria would have to be checked off before you could go forward with the first clinical trial to create a human this way. These are not easy to achieve, at least that's what we thought in terms of the Commission's work and reporting. We thought it would be, at least a decade before anybody could get close to having checked all 10. It was, we thought, a pretty comprehensive list, and one that would make it appropriately difficult to go forward with heritable genome editing. But if it went forward, it would be done in a very responsible way with a lot of oversight and a lot of confidence about the science behind it. So some challenges with recommendations that are at the level of principles and even criteria is that those things are not the same as governance. Hard governance is laws and policies made by countries. Soft governance are things like biomedical journal editors that require certain behaviors in order to publish in their publications. So it's much more important, obviously, to have governance than it is just to have principles and recommendations, but you sort of need one to inform the other. Translating principles into governance requires privileging some principles over others. They're not all created equal, and different societies will have different answers to what those privileging, that order ought to be. Similarly, different societies weight physical and cultural harms in different ways, which would also lead to different answers to the governance question. And of course, medical tourism is a real concern when we're talking about international governance. How do we make sure that people don't go to a place that's just more liberal or more lax in allowing things to happen? So, of course, we all know this story, and it is, of course, in the aftermath of the National Academies report with all of its principles and its criteria. J.K. He announced at the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing that he had, in fact, gone forward, done heritable human genome editing, and 2 children had been born as a result. What to do about that, of course, became a big topic for the international community, and 2 international commissions were convened, named first by the WHO and then a second by the combination of the Royal Society in the UK and the National Academies in the US. I served on this particular committee, so we tried hard to craft recommendations that would go further than the report that I showed you before, to make sure that nothing like what J.K. Head did could happen again, that there'd be responsible oversight and governance. So we focused on 2 levels of governance. First at the national level, so at the country level, and you can read this quickly so I can move on, but there needs to be, we recommended certain capacity and certain rules at the country level before going forward and behaving in a way that was consistent with international oversight. And we thought there should be 3 functions there. 1, ongoing evaluation of the science and technology by some international panel or body. Second, a debate should happen internationally about when to use the technology and for what purposes. And then third, a mechanism for whistleblowing effectively. So some way for scientists in one country to make sure that when there were bad things happening in their country, they could report that to an independent body of some kind. So it takes me to close to the end of my time, but I want to say all of that work that I mentioned really was embedded in or informed the work of a committee that I also served on called CESTI, which you've already heard described by Dr. Dzau in his introductory remarks. This is a screenshot from an article that was published in the spring of 2022 in Issues in Science and Technology, describing the governance approach that CESTI undertook. here is our graphic, which tries to represent across the top A through E. There are high-level principles, which then correlate to policy goals along the left-hand side there, which are then enacted by policy tools for governance. And so this was our attempt to capture sort of everything I have said into a single graphic to try to guide not just reproductive technologies or genetic technologies or stem cell technologies, but really any emerging life sciences technology. Of course, now the devil will be in the details of the implementation, but we think this is a really good representation of the approach that ought to be undertaken and can apply quite widely to any of the kinds of emerging technologies that we've been talking about on this panel. My very last slide is just to say, if we don't take this area seriously, then we really only have a few options about what our future will look like, and only ourselves to blame about what they might look like if it's not the future that we hope. So one would be the unregulated frontier, which of course looks a lot like what we're seeing, at least when J.K. He undertakes something that seems irresponsible to most of the scientific community. I think the second approach, or second possibility, is what we would hope the future will hold, which is science in the public interest. So government investment and government oversight, harmonization across countries, and responsible ways forward. You could easily also see an approach that led to privatization. So that things like CRISPR could be, owned by very few private entities, and who would monopolize their access to them and their uses, and sort of only make their technologies available to those who could afford them. Or we could have country-level controls, but with limited cooperation. And so it would be sort of go to the country where what you want to do is available, and don't visit those where what you want to do is prohibited. I think everybody who's watching, and I hope we can talk more about this during the discussion, would hope that the answer is number two, is science in the public interest. But it will take a concerted effort and more discussions like the one we're having today for us to reach that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm gonna wait till my video's turned back on. Okay. There you go. So another outstanding talk. Our last talk is by David Winickoff. Now, he's going to have an interesting talk because in OECD, he's a senior policy analyst and secretary of the Working Party on Bio, Nano, Converging Technology. And so in this capacity, he leads research, multilateral work, and soft law development in areas of science, technology, and innovation at the international and national level. So Jeff will be talking about what he's doing at OECD. They're trying to take on the exact issue that Atul, Janet, and Jeff talked about. And they talk about how they can create anticipatory policy governance and transition from soft law recommendation to actually help government adopt some of the recommendation and make them more actionable. So let's listen to his video.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is David Winickoff. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I'll be speaking today about the international context of the governance of emerging technology, and especially do it from the perspective of the OECD, my organization. So tech governance today has actually risen to a very high level of international debate and agendas. The White House in the United States announced the launch of an international grand challenges on democracy-affirming technology. France has had an event and a program on technology for good. In London, in the UK, last November, there was held a forum as part of the G7 process called the Future Tech Forum. And the World Economic Forum as well has been working in this space. The OECD as well, in 2021, affirmed the importance that technology must be shaped responsibly through effective governance to ensure their benefits are distributed equally and the risks are successfully managed. They went on to say, these are the ministers of the OECD, we recognize the need to develop and strengthen standards for new and emerging technologies that reflect our shared values and keep pace with innovations reshaping our economies and societies. Taking an international approach to emerging technology governance poses a number of challenges and also opportunities. There are obvious value and political differences across countries. It's difficult finding a legitimate forum, and it's hard to be inclusive for global publics, and not to mention that the technological field is moving quickly. But there are great opportunities and there are advantages to international governance. The coordination or harmonization of approaches to promote efficiencies across jurisdictions, minimizing races to the bottom and technological tourism, and the opportunity for joint evidence gathering and learning. And this point about joint evidence gathering and learning has helped drive the work of the OECD in the area of international norms and standards. The OECD has 38-member organization. It's a 38-member international organization based in Paris with three main functions: research, convening, and the development of international soft law in policy fields. And that's what we're focusing on now, is what is a soft law and recommendations, and does this pose a model for technology governance? Well, OECD recommendations or soft law are not legally binding. They entail a moral and political commitment. They have the expectation that adherents will do their utmost to implement these recommendations. New members must demonstrate their compliance. Implementation is reviewed, and there's a focus on peer learning and exchanging best practices. And so in this international forum, I'd like to bring forward this idea that perhaps we should be paying attention to the international landscape of technology governance and what we can do about it. The starting point of the OECD's approach here is to address how to address the Collingridge dilemma. The dilemma is that if you govern earlier, the full consequences of the technology might not be fully apparent. And there's a danger of misguided or inadequate regulation, and unnecessary regulation can potentially constrain innovation. But if you govern later, changing course may become expensive, difficult, time-consuming, because technology is actually built into infrastructures. And end-of-pipe solutions might be just too late. So this militates for a more anticipatory approach to how we think about governing emerging technology. The international soft law and emerging technology governance is robust at the OECD. There's work on artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, biobanks and data repositories, genetic licensing, access to data, and an emerging policy framework on emerging technology for good or for technology governance. Developing these recommendations is both an epistemic and political process, requires a research and evidence base, governance landscape and gaps, good practices, the convening of stakeholders, government, private sector, civil society, and academia. The key point here is actually an inclusive process means that it'll be more likely to be taken up. And we've seen this in two recommendations in particular, a recommendation on artificial intelligence and also one on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And I'll say a couple of words about each of those. Before that, I just want to highlight the central challenge, not only of developing recommendations and guidelines, but the question of how to implement them. This is a challenge that was highlighted recently in the New England Journal by Victor, as well as Deborah Matthews and Celine Dalbat. And they said that we propose that a new governance framework should take those principles further to implementation. This was laying out some of the work of necessity that Victor was talking about earlier. So how to implement is a key challenge. In terms of the recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology, there are 9 principles. I'm going to look or focus on principle 4, which is foster scientific collaboration in neurotechnology innovation across countries, sectors, and disciplines. So how do we help member states and other stakeholders implement this principle? Well, it's important to see how we're trying to offer advice and instruction at least 3 levels. One is the principle itself, which I just read you, foster scientific collaboration. Then there's a set of directives, more specific directives that can help provide more guidance for relevant actors. And then under the next level, one could see the development of toolkits for neurotechnology policy and ethics. We don't have one yet for neurotechnology. The recommendation is too young. But this has been very important modality in other recommendations in areas. And I just highlighted one on water governance at the OECD. The toolkit for water policies and governance compiles policies, governance arrangements, and related tools that facilitate the design and implementation of water management practices in line with the OECD's recommendation. Under the AI principles developed by the OECD and its member states in 2019, it developed a set of principles for responsible stewardship and a set of principles on national policies and international cooperation for trustworthy AI. And in the wake of its passage, again towards implementation, the OECD has been working with members and stakeholders to set up what's been called an AI policy observatory, which is a platform to share and shape public policies for responsible, trustworthy, and beneficial AI. And the pillars of that observatory include a network of experts in AI bloggers, the AI principles and implementation guidance, AI trends and data, and countries and initiatives. And as part of this process, there remain a network of experts on AI connected to this implementation process. And there are currently three working groups and one task force on classification of AI systems, implementing trustworthy AI, and national AI policies. The other thing with OECD recommendations is there's an obligation on member states to report back how they've actually implemented the recommendation provisions. And the OECD is involved in the Secretariat in monitoring, collecting that data, and making it public, which is a way of kind of making accountable how countries are doing in the implementation process. We have worked carefully in terms of implementation on trying to map gaps and levers and incentives, and trying to lay out the set of actors, and this is a set of actors for the neurotechnology recommendation. As you see on the right-hand column, many different actors with different kinds of motivations, and these have to be tapped into for implementation guidance. To give you one example, we worked on actor maps for the private sector. Early stage entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, executives at larger companies, big biotech companies, philanthropic organizations. All of these are within a kind of ecosystem of industry, of business, but all of them have different kinds of incentives. And so productive or effective implementation must engage with these different categories of actors. I end with a question of, what would a global governance ecosystem for emerging technologies look like? And again, I hearken to this nice article in the New England Journal, which relates or which discussed this concept of a governance ecosystem. I think mostly within a national context. I think things get even more complicated when you look at the kind of nested jurisdictional differences, multiplied centers of potential governance. All of this could be described as an ecosystem, but it could also be described as a mess. So how do we actually coordinate some of this activity and some of this norm development across elements or aspects of the landscape? That's what I leave for this talk. I want to thank you for your attention, and I will not be able to join the discussion, but I look forward to hearing how it went. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It is 5 a.m. for you, so we're not expecting you to join us. But now we would have a panel discussion. And right now, I know that Janet, Rossant, and Atul, Butte, and myself will be the three on the panel. I believe Jeff Kahn is tentative. He may join us by iPhone. We'll see. But I think we got so much to talk about that it will be just great to have a discussion among the three panelists, and of course, discussion from all of you in attendance as well. So we heard a lot this morning or this afternoon on the complexity issue. You know, I keep thinking this Collins Ridge dilemma, when you do it, and most of the time, oh, Jeff, great to have you. And you've got your black tie on. Thank you.
I apologize for joining late, but I'm at a gala, as I told you, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, that's great. We're just starting to have a discussion on this whole area that all three of you, plus David, really teed up really well. And it's quite mind-boggling, because most of the time, we have a technology that's driven by scientists who's very exciting about, you know, what it could do, like AI or genome editing and areas that you guys talked about. And then, of course, to move it into the clinical arena, it has to go through the usual, you know, IRBs and others. But I think that really, when you really move this technology into possibility of transformation, which is very exciting, you begin to move into the commercial sector as well. And that's where, as Atul showed you, there are many people ready to say that is an exciting area and give you investment, and then you go and take it forward. Or for that matter, a big company can be licensing this. That being said, until it gets out there, such as Facebook, you probably don't really know the real impact of the technology. So we usually come a bit late. I guess this conversation here is to say, can we go upstream and be more anticipatory? So I just want to ask, first of all, a general question from all of you. I think many people talk about guidelines. Janet talked about professional societies, norms, guidelines, and even David Winickoff talked about soft governance, etc. How effective is it? You know, Janet, if you look at your stem cell SCCR guidelines, is it effective? When you hear Jeff Kahn talk about the Chinese investigator, Dr. He, in genome editing, well, he had the guidelines written, but he just simply ignored it.
Well, I think Jeff's example was a good one, where he gave us some details about the detailed guidelines that we put in place around genome editing to try and put guidelines in place, and yet one person went against it. I would say that the fact that one person went against it and nobody else did tells us that, in fact, the guidelines did work. And that, in fact, there has been, in the case of heritable genome editing, there's been quite a wide acceptance across different countries that this is not something that should go forward. So I think there's an acceptance in that particular case. However, I do agree that this balance between where you put a framework that is ahead of the game, that anticipates what's going to happen, and yet put a framework up front that doesn't impede the later development is always a challenge. And that's why guidelines and recommendations can be very useful, so long as they are constantly re-looked at. So recommendations that are made and put in stone. And I'm sorry, Jeff, but I think the guidelines from the different working groups on genome editing have now been sort of put in a book and put on a shelf. They're not going to be able to actually respond to things that are changing. So I think one of the biggest challenges I see, and it's certainly true for AI as well, is that things are moving so fast that we have to think about soft governance, I think, but also governance that is responsive and is continually looking forward and not back.
Yeah, but Jeff, I mean, we have laws about human stem cell, and what really happens is that it only applies to federally funded research, whereas private companies can just simply go buy this. And so these guidelines are really kind of professional guidelines. You know, us scientists will agree what not to do, what to do, but how, in fact, do you oversee and govern what's happening in the private sector? Jeff?
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge, and I agree with you, Janet, that sometimes all this work we do ends up in books on shelves, which of course is not our goal. I think your point, Victor, is an important one, and of course there are regulators like the FDA and the EMA that have the role of making sure that medicines, new drugs, devices, therapeutics that come to market are overseen and regulated. So I think we do have some mechanisms in place to do the kinds of work that I think we're all hoping can be done. It's a huge challenge when it comes to international issues, in that governments have to agree to follow similar rules, and that's where I think we're running into really challenging times. Right? Even when we recorded these the talks just a few weeks ago, the world was quite different than it is today. We've had North Korea shooting missiles and South Korea shooting missiles, and what's going on in Ukraine is seemingly increasingly dark. So the world seems to be going away from a globalized community and much more towards inward-looking nationalism, and that makes it really hard to govern emerging technologies, which don't seem to really rise to the level of concern, right? That these other things that are sort of existential demand attention for. So I don't know. I'm not. I don't feel like we don't have the tools. I'm not sure that the attention of the world community is on these kinds of issues at the moment, nor maybe should it be. And the last thing I'll say, to Janet's point, which I think is a good one about Dr. He, who I would characterize as a kind of rogue. There's nothing you can do to prevent rogue actors. No amounts of rules or kinds of rules or kinds of oversight will stop people from acting badly if they want to do so. And so I think we, need to do our best to create the guardrails and hope that governments are in every country that matters will follow them in a way that will help us guide these technologies in the most responsible way, and not try to govern to make sure that every rogue will be prevented, because I don't think that's possible.
Well, I want to come to Atul in a few minutes, but I got one more question. What both you said appears that there is a global norm that one can develop, and that most people would agree with it, but you have not considered the cultural aspect and the public opinion on this. After all, when it comes to fertilization, when it comes to this, there's a very different attitude from countries to countries about what can be done versus not. So I would like you to say, is it really possible to have an international norm when in fact there's so much dependent on the country and the culture and the people who's going to have to practice it?
Well, certainly in the area of human embryo research and all the aspects of that, including gene editing and stem cell models, big differences exist across countries. There's no question, and that is something that you have to take into account. But I think you can still, and ISSCR and indeed all the workshops on and working groups on gene editing have all put in place. These are some of the general principles that we think apply across all jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions where human embryo research, for example, is not allowed at all, then it's not allowed. But in situations where this is a potential kind of research that can be used, then I think there are guidelines that do cross, and they are some of the general principles, the ethical framework. And Jeff had a list of some of those that were applied. So I think there are common norms that you can put in place, but absolutely, you're never going to get by line, everybody to agree on everything across jurisdictions, because there will be big differences.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I think
what comes much closer to home is data and AI, as you talked about, because it affects all of us. And yet what I heard from you is like the Wild West, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
what exactly, what's the oversight on the use of data and in fact, the commercialization of data, if you will? And many people talk about data protection, data privacy by de-identification, but that's simply not sufficient. Want to say a word about that?
Yeah, sure. So in the United States, we have the blessing and curse of having HIPAA now for more than 25 years. And so it's understood what de-identification means. It's written into federal law. Yet that doesn't mean patients can't be re-identified. So just, for example, one of the questioners on the Zoom had a question about de-identification. De-identification doesn't mean open access, right? We still have to also additionally get users to attest they will not try to re-identify these individuals because they probably could. A big company with a lot of other data could re-identify. So de-identification, we would never say is perfect. One would have to have additional protections. But even HIPAA by itself, as useful as it is, hardly covers any of the companies I mentioned during the talk, right? HIPAA only covers, by definition, covered entities, which are the payers, the healthcare providers, the business associates of those two, the doctors. But a tech company that happens to have health data has no such governance under HIPAA. They're governed in the United States by the Federal Trade Commission, which is busy doing many other things besides health data regulation. For example, advertising and all the rest. So a very overworked body then has oversight instead of Health and Human Services. So, and this is just the United States. So you have GDPR now in Europe, with healthcare provisions there. California has its own state, has its own privacy and data protection rules, which may spread to other states. We'll see. Healthcare may or may not be covered eventually in that. So we are getting more federated in terms of these differences in these rules. But right now, when companies do acquire this de-identified data, they're certainly able to, you can see the value of those companies. Now, that being said, these are not necessarily evil companies because they have health data. They would proclaim that they're doing the world some good in figuring out what the right drugs are and right medicines to use, the most cost-effective way to take care of patients. But they're certainly using data to do it. And in many cases, in all cases that I showed, absolutely legal in the United States.
Yeah. So I think earlier you talked about AI and the whole concern about algorithms and trustworthiness of AI. So who's overseeing this? Is it regulates the device, or how do you know how good the data is and how the algorithms are? Yeah,
so right now, and this is changing in real time, as of a few weeks ago, the FDA reasserted that it is certainly in charge and says that they've always been in charge of something called software as a medical device, or SAAMD. So software as a medical device includes algorithms, certainly artificial intelligence, but it only goes so far. So for example, if I wanted to use AI in my garage doing something, there's no body that's going to govern me, right? It's when I apply it to patients, and then, for example, that patient care is paid for by CMS, let's say a Medicare, Medicaid system, or other governmental systems, then there's some authority that they have over me. If I'm trying to use this AI, for example, to deliver care or to help me deliver care, then the FDA might get involved. But in many cases, we have, it's certainly usually a problem set number 1 or number 2 in many medical informatics classes to develop an AI, given some data. It's not very hard to do. There's no FDA or FTC or F anything to regulate those. So it's much easier to build these. So the line between that, building them and then using them in care is a very soft one in many medical systems. It's too hard, actually, in many others. But the governance right now would be the FDA for some of these.
So I want to open up to the audience, but let me ask another question. You and Jeff both serve on CESTI. Were we smoking something? I mean, is something really good going to come out of it? So I think about something like this. The Berman report, actually, right? The Berman report about human subject protection became a norm. You have to have IRBs, etc. It somehow or other, through a series of thinking about what can be done, it became policy and norm. Is it possible, based on what you were saying earlier, that number one, we want to do anticipatory governance, we want to get the whole ecosystem all buy-in, we want to be able to look at many sectors, because as you pointed out, take any of the technology being discussed today, there's always the issue of equity, ethics, affordability, you name it. So a multi-sectoral system will allow you to look at new technologies coming out and be very early to say, what do we need to do to make sure that we reduce the potential harm and increase the maximum benefit? So talk to me a little bit, either one of you. Is the whole idea of creating a framework real? I mean, can it be done?
Jeff, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. You can think while I talk, Atul. So the Belmont report is a really interesting example, Victor. I appreciate you bringing it up. So that's, for those of you who aren't familiar, is from a national commission that did its work in the late 1970s in the United States. It articulated a set of principles, to Janet's earlier point and the points that I made in my talk, that were meant to address the shortcomings of what was going on in research in the US in the aftermath of the so-called Tuskegee syphilis study. So the four principles that were identified were then translated into policy. This is maybe the key point to answer your question, Victor. The Belmont report didn't make policy. It rather identified principles of ethics of protection of human subjects, which then the Department of, it was HEW in those days, Health, Education, and Welfare, before HHS, had to implement as policy, which they did, which is the rules that we all know about IRBs and informed consent. So what I think CESTI has the ability and power to do is articulate the kinds of principles that the Belmont report did. The question is whether they get translated into policy. And if so, what's the motivation for doing that, right? Where's the incentive? And that to me is a really hard, I don't see a path, to be frank. And Atul is making the point, I think, in his comments just now, that it's kind of the Wild West. And so there doesn't seem to be a kind of place where there'll be one agency that will take charge and say, these are the rules that we'll all live by when it comes to fill in the blank, AI being the example we just heard about.
Well, I would tell you that, Jeff, Atul, go ahead.
I'll be really brief. First of all, it's an honor for you to compare our work to the Belmont report. I'll just say that. First of all, I never thought it could be that important. But Jeff makes a great point. The Belmont report is important, but it's still just HHS, right? I have plenty of neighbors in tech companies that run experiments on people who don't even know how to spell IRB, right? I mean, they have no reason to. So it governs us. It governs the governed. There are many other entities that probably should be taught this and have no idea what it is. So that's the problem when it's so grandiose. So I think the challenge is how to not make this a book that then ends up on a shelf, right? And for that to happen, this has to be a continual dialogue, right? It's a loud world. It's a noisy world. People forget what happened 15 minutes ago. If this is a book and then a year later something happens, people are going to even forget this report came out. So it'll have to be an ongoing process to keep this in people's minds, that if you're ever stuck, here's the way to get unstuck. That's going to be the challenge.
Yeah. Janet, any comments?
I just wanted to comment on, David isn't here, but I thought that his presentation on the way that the OECD is working was an interesting one. And I would question whether you really have the capacity to put in place an overall governance framework for all new and emerging technologies, because clearly what OECD has done is to take one at a time and really do, work on recommendations for AI, recommendations for neurotechnologies, etc. But again, they had within those exactly what you were talking about there, starting with a set of principles, but then also a soft governance model in which people had to sign on to those principles. And I think that's That's what you need to be moving towards, is something that people can see, and different players, and he had a long list of all the players for even any one of those, all the players that need to sign on if you want to see implementation of those principles. I would be a bit worried about trying to take on everything.
Yeah, so Janet, I think the way we're looking at it is something like this. We'll have a report that will talk about certain principles and actionable principles. Following that, we've already been engaging with the US government, the White House Office of Science Technology Policy, to look at what we're going to do with those recommendations. The idea would be, as you said, to form, say, a pilot group that would take individual technologies through those principles and to look at the lessons learned, and then fundamentally get to the point where eventually we think we're at a place that can actually get into policy. That's a long journey. Tom Solomon, perfect timing. I've been trying to call on you. And so Tom is the VP of Academy of Medical Sciences of the UK. Tom, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me, Victor?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Well, firstly, thanks to all the speakers for a fascinating session. You don't want me to unmute, do you, whoever's controlling it? Do you want me to turn my camera on? Okay, sorry, I'll be right with you in a second. There we go. Okay, hi. So really interesting discussion, especially around the genome editing. And Janet mentioned the professional societies, the funders, the journals, and we had a big discussion this afternoon about the roles of journals in other ways, and professional accreditation, all these soft measures. And then Jeffrey mentioned the rather more hard governance and the law. I guess it's important. One thing that's important is to make sure that these are all saying the same thing. And I can imagine that there will be times when, particularly some of the softer measures, you might have journals following one set of guidelines, professional societies saying something different. So my question, I guess, is how you keep all of these things lined up. And in particular, if we think about the Chinese researcher, I had to just look back at it again now, because I couldn't quite remember whether this person had wiggled between the governance and was sort of, because they'd been ahead of it and it was like the Wild West. But I think actually at the end of the day, they were found to have broken the laws. And I think that's quite important, because that tells us that it wasn't so much that the guidelines were lagging behind the science, that, the rules were there and they were just not being followed. But how we tie all these things together, it'd be good to hear the perspective of Janet and Jeffrey on this, and maybe you as well, Victor. Thank you.
Well, I think that I'm not sure I can really address that question in a very meaningful way, because I think you've raised an important area that would apply in all these technologies, is bringing all the different players to the table to agree on exactly what the guidelines should be and making sure that they apply within their jurisdictions. And if we just go back to AI and the big data, we already heard from Atul how many different components and players there are in that scenario. So the thought of really trying to bring in guidelines that will be something that everybody can sign on to is indeed a challenge. I think that the ISSCR guidelines in a small restricted area, I mean, human embryo research seems very important to me because I'm interested in this, but it's not a huge area. It's nothing like the impact of big data or genomics on healthcare today. But in that area, I think the guidelines, because that comes from an international society, does have an international reach, and it has been able to pull in all the different players. But it doesn't mean, again, as we said earlier, a rogue actor can still be out there.
I would just really briefly answer your question, Tom, by saying, I think the journal's role is to say, you need to follow the rules that are in place in the jurisdiction where you're doing the science. So it sort of redounds back to the governments. Right? The journals can't be the the policymakers. They can just be the kind of police or the police of the policies, I think. So it doesn't require everybody aligning. It just requires the journals having something to say, has to be followed. You're muted, Victor.
Victor, you're muted.
Now, Atul has always written that this is a multi-tier governance process. And I think that's exactly what Jan is saying, right? So the entire ecosystem and community all have to play a role. That includes not only publication, scientific conduct, but also even the, trade and cross-border issues, etc. So I think it's a whole issue. On the J.K. He issue, Tom, I think, shall we say that he broke a law, but it's subject to interpretation. And the Chinese wanted to make a very important statement because they were highly criticized by actually even not only having an investigator going into this area, but even earlier in some of the early work that they did. So I think if this were happen in another country, say in ours, I mean, I don't think he might have gone to jail. It might be just scientific misconduct to be banned from science because of ethical boundary and not go to jail. So I don't think there's so many things have pre-existing law they can easily point to, right? Two, that's probably particularly true for data space.
It is true. Victor, they're giving us the nod that we need to wrap up. So I'll just say the laws are way behind and they're going to always stay behind. The last questioner asked about the public, and I think the public is the ultimate participant that needs to be involved in all of this work. But there are always going to be rogue actors in data and rogue companies too. And all we can do is try to stay ahead and do the best we can with these frameworks.
Thank you very much. I think that is an excellent point to stop this session. Thank you again, everyone. Excellent presentations.
Jeff, go back to do whatever you're doing in your black tie.
I think it's a glass of wine here.
I'm finished. It turns out I'm finished, but I ran out of the event just to be with you all. So I'm happy that it all worked.
We're so glad you joined us. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Atul.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff and Tom. Thank you for being with us.